All right, today we're going to look at setting up a wet palette. First thing I do is I wet my sponge. I usually do this with some cold water. You use hot water if you want to. It doesn't need to be like completely like dripping wet, it just needs to be saturated. And then you can take and put a little bit of water in there. Try doing all sides there. Let's get it in. And so that way the sponge will stay wet. The second thing is I use plain old cheap printer paper. It came with some pieces, but they were just kind of like eh. The reason I use printer paper and why you should just use regular paper is because it's porous and it has where it'll allow water to go through it. I just get it wet on both sides so that way it's permeated through. You can use hot water to kind of help with this some, but in the end it will get cold. But it kind of opens up the pores in the paper. And again, I don't use wax paper or parchment paper because with the nature of those, they have wax in both of them, and that is actually water resistant. So in the end, your paper will end up not working the way it should with it. And I just make sure there's no bubbles in it or anything like that, and it lays flat on the sponge. A little excess water out of there. You don't want any bubbles in there because that could cause your paints to dry out, because that'll be an area of air, and you don't. And the whole point of the wet palette is for your paints not to dry out. Also, another fun thing is to like stick pennies in the corners to make sure the corners don't roll up. My piece of paper should be big enough so it doesn't do that. As much as you want everything wet, you don't want everything too wet on top, because the idea is to keep them wet but not making them watery. So even though this is like completely like water soluble, stuff like that, whatever, you don't want it just like glistening wet on top. It'll have where you can still add your kind of like slight water to your paint mix, or your gloss, your paint mix, or any kind of mediums to your paint mix and stuff like that. That's what you want. So now I have a wet paper, but I don't have water on top. You don't want water on top. That'll make your paints runny, more to separate out, stuff like that, and it won't have where you can control them as much as you want. When you go to use your wet palette, you'll have your paint on there and stuff, and if it does dry out, or if you're mixing paints together and you start rubbing on there with your paintbrush, don't do it too heavily or hard, because no matter what, you'll start to kind of build up and break down your paper. You can get like a thicker paper or higher quality paper, but again, you still want a paper that water will permeate through. Well, honestly, there's not much to it. It is different. If you've done any kind of miniature painting or toy painting or any kind of painting in general, it's good to learn how to use the wet palette and just take a step out of your norm and try something different. It'll get your paints to last longer. Really, it's just for like your painting session to continue on for hours. If you get more than like a day out of it, then that's just a bonus. I think that's about all the tips I got for wet palettes. If you have any tips yourself, add them down in the comments. Remember, like, share, subscribe. If you like this, tell me what you want to like see test it out next with like painting and everything. Love to hear from y'all. So have a good day. Get painting.